When it comes to horror franchises, endless amount of sequels are given, typically. But when you think of the Blair Witch series, there aren't really a lot of movies, especially when compared to other franchises. You have the first, a sequel that's more meta than most people give credit for, and then a direct continuation to the first that ignores the second movie. But you would be mistaken to think that this franchise doesn't have a plethora of media to look at. We would be here all day if we took a look at every last thing this franchise has to offer, so we're going to bring that number down to something a bit more reasonable, mainly just video games and movies. This isn't going to be a recap of movie events or discussing how they were made. Instead, I want to do more of a deep dive on the lore, how the different types of media use the Blair Witch mythos and build upon or even retcon some things. I might do some minor recapping, I'm sure, but let's start with the foundation that everything the Blair Witch mythos is built upon, that being our two major characters that are referenced everywhere in this franchise, Rustin Parr and Ellie Kedward. The story of Ellie Kedward begins in the 17th century, a woman who lived in the town of Blair who was accused of witchcraft. It's said she lured children to her home and stole their blood for witchcraft. Naturally, this is where the aftermath kind of splits. In both retellings, Ellie Kedward is banished from the town during the winter. However, one paints her as being banished and never found again, while the second goes into more detailed events before that, continuing with the banishment during winter except tied to a tree and left for dead, and again the story here splits. She was left for dead and tied, but when they went back she was gone. Or you can believe the other account, of children going back to where she was tied up and finding her alive. Here the children would take her blood and paint their handprints on her skin. This part lines up with some lore later on, but after this she would go missing at some point, leading to the start of the legend of the Blair Witch. All sorts of bad stuff would happen, eventually leading to the abandonment of the town of Blair. Harsher winters than what was previously known, all the children who accused Ellie would go missing, and by a certain point half the town. The location, and especially the woods, would be believed as cursed and the townspeople would flee. It wouldn't be until the early 1800s that Blair would once again be a town, although now known as Burkittsville. We'll go into the details of the Burkittsville mishaps in a bit, but we now need to jump to the second main person of interest, Rustin Parr. The events behind Rustin Parr was the last big piece before the first movie. In the 1940s, a man named Rustin Parr lived on the outskirts of Burkittsville. He was a hermit who mostly kept to himself. But in the months of November 1940 to June 1941, he would go on a spree of stealing Timmies, typically one per month and the occasional two sprinkled near the end. He would lure them to his home with promises of candy and would eventually slaughter them. His method was eerily particular though, making one stand in the corner while he took care of the other. They would be disemboweled and have strange markings put on them, which is very familiar to another incident down to the same method of disemboweled and markings. We'll cover that soon enough. So over the course of that year, he ended up taking 8 Timmies, but only dealing with 7 of them. One of them would be left alive and his name would be Kyle Brody. When the deed was done, Rustin Parr would come into town and say he's finally finished. He would be arrested for his crimes and eventually killed. Rustin Parr took full accountability for the crimes he did, but he did say it was under the guise of a woman who told him to do it. Now, the important factor is he never really outright claims it's the Blair Witch. He just goes into detail about a woman's voice he would hear in his head, and would make mention of a woman appearing before him to tell him he was finished, but he never directly claims Blair Witch. After this event, we have the main event that takes place, the trio of amateur filmmakers creating a documentary on said person, the Blair Witch Project.
To explore the Blair Witch.
The Blair Witch Project covers the events of 1994 where Heather, Michael, and Joshua would go missing and their tapes recovered a year later. They would head to the town of Burkittsville looking to make a documentary on the Blair Witch, leading them to interviewing local townsfolk and heading to 2 locations in the Black Hills Forest, Coffin Rock and a cemetery that Heather was made aware of that's a bit off the beaten path. Heather was the main driving force behind this project, this being her thesis for school, which had her asking help from her fellow filmmaker and colleague Joshua, with Michael tagging along because of his knowledge in soundscape. The beginning interviews are probably the most important and interesting part of this movie when just looking strictly for more lore. We get people's retelling of events like Rustin Parr, the Blair Witch uses the parenting method, but ending on an interesting interview from the town crazy.
To kind of make ends meet, my dad and I would go fishing down by Tappy's Creek, and all of a sudden I felt like something was near me. Right. It was like a woman, only on her arm, on her hands and everything. It was like hair, like a real dark, almost black hair. Her arms, she had like a shawl,
Right.
wool shawl over her.
And she scared you? She threatened you?
She didn't say anything, but she just kept staring, and then
Right.
she opened up her shawl.
And what was under there?
And under it, there was hair on her body like a
So she
horse.
was...
While it doesn't seem like much and doesn't really match the overall mythos we'll learn, the important part is the creek she mentions, though I do think her detail of the witch is quite horrific. Just after this, we get the scene with 2 fishermen who give more of a backdrop about the creek and name drops another relevant character, Robin Weaver.
Some girl back in the late 1800s, Robin Weaver, I believe her name was, supposedly just wandered off, disappeared into the woods. 3 days later, she just appears back on her grandmother's porch.
Right.
Yeah, she was babbling something about an old woman whose feet never touched the ground.
This creek or river is an important area because it's one of the many areas the townsfolk believe to be cursed due to what happened there, and also shows up a ton over the course of the franchise. Outside of these early interviews, the movie is fairly tame in what it shows, or delivers in aspects to the lore, but at the same time, it sets the foundation for everything. Firstly, rocks and twigs. Nothing crazy happens to the trio until the rocks are messed with. While the rocks at first glance seem like just a burial mound, Heather does make it a point to recall what Mary Brown said about rocks.
Dude, guys. Do you remember something that Mary Brown said the other day? What was the story from the Bible that she was telling us? It was Esau, but it was something about a pile of rocks.
There is this part in the Bible that is very interesting and could possibly correlate to the witch. As for the twigs, it's mostly just the witch's calling card, in the movies at least. Second and most commonly associated with the witch is time. This is built upon in the sequels, while here it's a lot more subtle. The group ends up walking in one direction and winding up back at locations they just passed.
No, that's the tree we crossed. That tree is down. That's the same one. You gotta be kidding me! This is a joke!
No.
This is not funny!
It's the same.
Making it feel like it's an endless loop. This feels more like the forest shifting and less to do with time, but time does play a big factor with the final scene. When they follow the voice they believe to be Joshua, they wind up at the abandoned and now ruined house of Rustin Parr. But according to the files, this house couldn't be here, because the house was burned down shortly after Rustin Parr's confession back in the 1940s. Meaning this had to take place in the past, but that's not always the case. We'll learn in Blair Witch Volume 1 that time is both present, future, and past colliding, which does align with future sequels. Let's go over some of the more minor witch occurrences. We hear Joshua's plea for help a couple times in the later part of the movie, where sometimes it sounds like him and other times... But that also could be me just reading a bit too much into it. But regardless, the witch has shown to be able to copy the voices of people. Children laughing is also pretty prevalent throughout the franchise. The only thing mentioned here, and really isn't anywhere else, is the slime. Personally, I think it was just Ivan Ooze.
Ladies and gentlemen, the ooze is back!
That about wraps up everything for the first movie, but we'll come back here when we have some more information and play with some ideas. On July 11th, 1999, a few weeks before the premiere of the movie, the Sci-Fi Channel released a mini documentary titled The Curse of the Blair Witch. This is a really nice companion piece to the movie, and gives a lot to look at. It goes over what I went over in the beginning of the video: Ellie Kedward, Rustin Parr, and even more of a background dive on the three main characters in the movie. This documentary is played straight, as if the events of the movie are real. Watching it now, you can clearly tell in some regards, but watching this in 1999 was probably mind-blowing. Although, I do think they got a bit too cheeky towards the end with the whole "is it a hoax" thing.
Well, there's always that possibility, but I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think it would be remote that it's a hoax because of the way the tapes were hidden and the fact that just to view the tapes, they are very realistic, and the tape is from a time period that the students would have been able to have taped it.
The nice thing about this is there's a very clear timeline drawn. We talked about Ellie Kedward and Rustin Parr, but let's fill in all the stuff in between. Starting in 1809 with the Blair Witch Cult. This is a book that had all the details about the witch, how she controlled animals of the forest itself, and our very first mention of her feet not touching the ground. I don't know what it is about this line, but it always gives me the heebie-jeebies. Ugh. When they mention the forest, they talk about how the branches themselves are alive, which trees are alive, but it's supposed to be more ominous, I guess. Then we get our very first event in the town of Burkittsville, and also the very first death blamed on the Blair Witch in 1825. This is the creek that was mentioned in the first movie. According to the eyewitness of the event, a girl was playing in the creek which was incredibly shallow when she was suddenly taken by a hand and drowned. There's a total of 12 key witnesses who saw this. I don't think this number really means anything, but it just seemed a little odd, so I figured I would add it. After the drowning, the river became cursed. It was said to be oily, and the town could no longer use it as a source of water, alongside stick figures floating down the river. Our next time event brings us to 1886, 60 years later. This is the Robin Weaver incident. Robin was playing in the forest when she came across a woman whose feet did not touch the ground. The woman didn't say anything and led Robin back to her house, and left her in the basement. After some hours passed, Robin would eventually escape as nobody came back, and would find her way home safely. Well, while Robin was in the basement, a search party was sent to find her, and when that search party didn't return back themselves, the second was sent out to look for the first party. The first party would be found at Coffin Rock in what could only be called a ritualistic setting, disemboweled and markings over their body, kind of similar to what was said about Rustin Parr, right? The men would leave and return later to bring the bodies back. Only the bodies vanish, but the lingering smell of death was still there. The next incident would be what Rustin Parr did in 1940. We went over most of the details of this event, but there's one important thing we learned from here, which is this single line that Rustin Parr apparently told Kyle Brody.
When he came back, he told me not to be sad, that he'd bring someone else back soon.
Now, this could have easily been interpreted as another Timmy being snatched, but I think this is in reference to Heather and Mike. Especially with what we know about time, because this is also where we learn that Rustin Parr's house was burned down, but we know that they end up there at the end of the movie, but no one really acknowledges that part in the documentary. All we get is the head investigator saying he did a good job. Rustin Parr also makes mention he wasn't the one to do the painting of the hands. This makes Rustin Parr such an interesting character. Because he doesn't really lie, or at least seem so, he openly admits to what he does, believes he'll be saved, and strongly sticks to the belief of that woman's voice. So why would he lie about not doing a painting? It's just interesting to think about. We also find out Heather was a bit obsessed about the witch, being the head of this project and the one who started it, and finding out from her diary entries how she really wants to meet Ellie Kedward, and even finding sympathy for her. We've reached the point where this is everything the Blair Witch franchise is about. From here on out, things will only add upon the existing lore and retcon a few things. But you do have to ask yourself, how the hell do you start a franchise off of this? Unlike other horror properties, there isn't really a mascot here nor a survivor to push the series forward. We all know there was supposed to be something in the movie that was supposed to be the witch with the iconic line of, "What is that?" But we never saw. A toy maker would make a figure based on what the witch was supposed to look like. You're either seeing a toy on screen or a Google image, I don't know which one it is yet. Personally, I'm not a fan of this. This doesn't fit what the witch looks like according to eyewitness accounts. Sure, it has a shawl, but it looks way more demonic, which is kind of funny considering the next piece of media. But if we're to believe people who saw the witch sounds more floaty and ghosty. But what if I told you, maybe there is no witch? When you have an insanely successful indie horror movie, there's gonna be a sequel, but you should also strike while the iron is hot. Better yet, what if you did a double whammy and did another movie, but right before that, do a tie-in video game? Tie-in movie games were a big craze back in the day. Most weren't that good, but there were some gems. Nowadays, the closest you get to something like that is a Fortnite skin, which is more of a collaboration than just a tie-in, so that's what Terminal Reality did. I already did a whole video based on Nocturne, but what you need to know in case you didn't see that video is this game is a horror game that said what if spooky shit was real, and there was a team dedicated to cases like that. Taking place only a few days after Rustin Parr's arrest, we're sent to the town of Burkittsville to investigate the Blair Witch. The stranger isn't really fond of this case, so instead we'll be playing as Holiday. She's typically the one creating new weapons and dissecting the corpse. So with this being her first real field mission, the game is nice enough to give us a tutorial that acts as debriefing for the character in game. This is only 1 year after the release of Nocturne, and I gotta say, I can see the upgrades. Models look better and the game feels a bit more refined. They also removed the jump button, so no more platforming sections. Things are starting to look up. If only I could get a map. Now can I get a hot tub? Immediately we can see the effort the team at Terminal Reality put into the game, creating a little section of the town of Burkittsville alongside a surprising amount of cast of characters to investigate, with the townsfolk feeling like they're inspired by the interviewees of the first movie, even including big name characters like Kyle Brody, Mary Brown, yes that crazy lady is here, except as a little girl and she's still a little crazy.
Where have you been? I thought it was burnt. Are you okay? Emily, you shouldn't talk to her. My mom says she's... No, wait!
Even including Robin Weaver. While this game does indeed take place in the past, it does push forward some interesting lore and even ask some pretty interesting questions. The game takes place over the course of a few days. Within those days, you're tasked to get to the bottom of the Rustin Parr case and see if the Blair Witch is real. Here you can talk to townsfolk to find out more details about Rustin's case, the history of Burkittsville, and try our best to even help out Kyle Brody, who plays a pretty prominent role in this game overall. The town is by far the most interesting aspect to me, feeling almost like a murder mystery game, trying to find clues, having an extremely useful journal that keeps track of dialogue, and even having newspaper clippings with full articles you can read. Of course, the game does have some action elements to it, and it's just not good. Luckily, it's mostly avoidable except for the first night where you have to kill everyone in the town to progress, but once you reach the forest areas, you can start running from enemies. Except the mandatory boss fights. The forest is really cool, until it's not cool. The game does evoke the feeling of being lost in the forest pretty strongly, and at times even creating its own looped areas that require outside help to get us through, but it does feel a bit too much at times. Enemies can be annoying, everything looks kind of samey, and we do have a map, but it's practically useless. But hey, thanks for giving us a map. When we're in the other world, the map kind of just shows question marks, and we have to do our best to navigate the area by ourselves. In the forest, we can travel between two main locations: the ruined remains of Rustin Parr's house, Coffin Rock, and eventually the house of a friend who helps guide the way. His name is Askaya. He is important not just because he lives in these woods, but he sets the precedent in this game that there is no witch. Or at least the witch isn't the reason behind all the problems. The game establishes that bad shit has been going down in Burkittsville, or the town of Blair, long before Ellie Kedward arrived. This doesn't mean that Ellie wasn't a witch or still could be a factor at play, but that may be something more and in fact is. Coffin Rock is home to a demon, and that demon latches itself onto a vessel, and basically requires a sacrifice. Now, for the remainder of the game, we need to find out who the sacrifice is and who's been possessed. At a point in the game, we can record a conversation that Mary Brown was having with no one, but through a cool little puzzle, we can find out someone was actually there.
It's cold still, man. Where have you been? At his house. I thought it was burned. Right? Are you okay? Tell me if you're sick. We can bring you. Emily, you shouldn't talk to her. My mom says she's... No, wait!
She also asks if we find Mr. Brownie if we can bring it back to her, which is over by Coffin Rock and is a teddy bear. So all indications point to Mary Brown being the next victim. Now, to find out who is possessed, we don't need to look too far and instead need to look at another victim, Kyle Brody. When first visiting Kyle, he'll sneak us a drawing that asks him to help him, and we'll find a more sinister drawing left by him later in the game. Getting rid of the demon latching on won't really solve the problem, since the demon will just find its way back to the forest and wait, but also be extremely mad. The game sets up those little stick figures, which are called Twanas, as gateways to another time, which allows us to travel to Rustin Parr's house before it was burnt down and find the coolest thing imaginable. Before we go any further, I just want to fangirl out a little here. I was not expecting anything like this. Seeing the crossover between movie and game be fully established in a pretty meaningful way is pretty cool, especially with the added knowledge of how time works, how it's actively the present, past, and future. It doesn't feel like a cheap Easter egg and actively works towards exploring the lore of the Blair Witch, yet also being really cool. With the knowledge of how Twanas work, we can start theory crafting a trap for the demon, but we need one that has his name in order to send him back to where he came from. We have another that'll bait him, I believe, so we head to town, knock the demon/witch out of Kyle, and get a crazy revelation.
What was the witch making you do?
I was telling people to do things.
Like Rustin Pa?
Yes.
Wait, I'll get more into that in a bit. For now, the priest is also being possessed, so we hit him with a shovel and proceed forward to trapping the demon. The stranger shows up as some added backup, but gets trapped, so we get help from Robin Weaver instead, who has the Twana we need alongside a note for us. We head off into the other dimension, take the trap boy, put the demon away, and then seal him up. While the entire game's story is built on there being no witch, the final scene is one of some mysterious rocks appearing and a stick figure underneath teasing that maybe there was something more here after all. So, this game is the first in a trilogy of games. We even run into a character we'll be playing as later, but the one thing about this trilogy is it kind of twists the Blair Witch mythos with that of Native American mysticism. While this isn't a bad way of explaining the supernatural parts, it does take away the magic, I feel. I do think it would have worked if the future games did better with elaborating more, or we got a second movie from the original team who fleshed out the story on their own terms and not through a collaboration of a 3-hour game and some pretty bad sequels. Spoiler alert. The fun part of the Blair Witch mythos is how the lore is built upon Ellie Kedward, and this doesn't fully discredit that, at least in this game, but it does detract from it, making it less about her and more so, ooh, woods are evil. Then you include Spook House because if this was canon, then Spook House is canon, leading a lot of people to treat these 3 games as non-canon. But I will say, I do think some aspects are canon. Not necessarily the Twanas working as portals, but I do think the witch has her own dimension, or at least an area she controls time over, and that Ellie and the forest work separately but also together. However, the bigger takeaway is the possession aspect. Kyle Brody was talking about how he was telling people to do things, and admits to even telling Rustin Parr what to do and the priest. And while you can discredit the game, we can take this aspect as a bit of truth or theory, especially when looking at the next piece of media. Before we jump over to that, I do want to talk about another theory that opens up now. That being Mike was possessed. This one seems pretty common in the community, with the majority of evidence being Mike kicking the map into the river, his complete breakdown, and eventually standing in the corner in the ending. It all lines up pretty neatly. I know the flip side to this one is that Heather is the one possessed, but I was never really a fan of that one. The Mike one makes sense because, as the lore establishes, sometimes you just hear a voice to tell you to do things. Subscribe. Just some final thoughts on the game before we move on, but if you want to jump to the next piece of media, feel free to use the timestamp somewhere on the screen. I'm not offended, I promise. Fingers crossed, pinkies. As much as I like aspects of this game, I would be lying to you if I told you this was an enjoyable time. This game is incredibly janky. I had the game crash on me, I had cutscenes take forever to start because the character couldn't walk to the correct place, I had dialogue not play, I had doors take forever to open, and game-breaking bugs apparently.
This book, The Ancient Evil of the New World.
When starting the game, you get a choice between combat difficulty and puzzle difficulty. Only, there's like one puzzle in the entire game. When you finally get a chance to talk to the sheriff, he clearly doesn't like you.
I know why you're here. Martinsburg's out of my jurisdiction. Check with the sheriff there. Listen, lady, 8 children disappeared from this town. One of them is back home right now, staring at the corner of his room. The other 7 we dug out of shallow graves in Parr's basement. We searched every corner of that house. There was nothing else there. Be on your way.
His deputy, on the other hand, there's something there. He's willing to help, we just need to get some alone time with him. If we head over to the diner, the sheriff also comes in for his morning breakfast, and this will be the solution to the puzzle on normal. On hard, he eats his food so incredibly fast, and ends up back at the hall to give us a talking to.
Listen, you sneaky broad. I knew as soon as you left the diner you were up to no good. This is your last warning. You'd best back off. Come on, Charlie.
You need to find another solution, which revolves around talking to the editor of the newspaper to get a picture of the school being vandalized. We can use this as inspiration, and this too has different solutions. The wrong way is to pick up some red paint from the convenience store and use that. The game is smart though, because we were the only person to buy red paint, so it's easily traceable back to us, giving us a game over. The correct way is to get chalk from the classroom. This is where the game broke. I tried to walk by the teacher while she was sleeping, but it woke her up and triggered the conversation. According to guides online, once you do another event, she'll go back to sleep. She never slept, no matter what I did. My final complaint is a technical one. There's mandatory boss fights, and the fights are whatever really. The first one is just a giant scorpion, but the camera decides to do whatever this is, and the scorpion instantly kills you if it picks you up. So with the camera flickering and the insta-kill, it makes this fight annoying. The next boss fight also does the same camera flickering, and it's even worse because you're supposed to kick some rocks to then be able to damage the sticks. However, with all the constant flickering, it makes it hard to know when you're in range to interact with the rocks, making the fight drag on for what feels like forever. This could all be because of modern hardware though. When it comes to older PC games like this, they weren't really future-proof, and high FPS sometimes causes the game engines to react in weird ways. But it also could be because the game is shit.
We haven't even made it to Book of Shadows yet. You guys know Showtime?
Well, when the Blair Witch project first aired there was another special documentary called The Burkittsville 7. I know I just said most people don't consider the games around this time canon, but the theory that Kyle Brody was the actual one behind the murders was a pretty common theory at the time, and gained even more traction with this documentary, as this documentary was so dedicated to that. It goes over the same basic mythos, but it does make a bit of a continuity error when mentioning the Coffin Rock part, now claiming it was a missing boy and not Robin Weaver. That aside, the documentary follows Chris Carrizico as he lays out his evidence and claims to Kyle Brody being the true mastermind. We get detailed accounts of Kyle Brody's childhood, that being one of a hard upbringing due to his father, but also interesting tidbits we didn't get beforehand, like Kyle playing by the river, catching frogs and snipping all of their limbs to see if frogs have, and I quote, feelings. Yeah, something wrong with that boy. It's interesting just how much rivers play a part in the Blair Witch mythos, always involved in some sort of capacity. Another thing mentioned now is Kyle Brody mentioning in great detail how Emily Hollins was taken, despite that happening 2 weeks prior to Kyle Brody's own kidnapping. Also, when looking for a connection between the 8 abductions, there's nothing really tying them together, as none of the victims knew each other. But Kyle Brody knew every single one of the victims. Kyle was apparently the one put into the corner during every one of the killings, when previously it sounded like it was pairs and one by one. Now it's Kyle as the consistent one in the corner. As Kyle grew older, he only grew more troubled, constantly in and out of institutions, trouble with the law, before finally winding up in an insane asylum, where he ended up in a few scenes of a documentary called White Enamel. White Enamel was a documentary that took a deeper look into the living conditions and just a deeper dive into the asylums around Burkittsville. This caught the eye of Chris because even though Kyle was only seen in a few scenes, he figured the director might have some extra footage, and he in fact did. The extra footage consisted of Kyle standing in the corner saying, "Never given," which was something people said Rustin Parr also said the night before he was executed. There was also this short scene of Kyle drawing or writing this letter. Chris went out and asked help from a few different people to analyze this scene, but one found it to be inconclusive due to the shot of the scene, and not actually getting the picture, so she was of the belief you can't really make anything out. The other person he sent it to said, "Yeah, that's some witch shit." She believes it to be a certain language that was used for cults and the like, which also showed up all over Rustin Parr's house, which baffled Chris because Rustin Parr was illiterate, but somehow he could write these symbols. So Chris didn't buy it. A good counter to Rustin not drawing the symbols comes from the previous documentary, that he wasn't the one who did the handprints all over the house. But the biggest piece of evidence comes in the form of a former priest who oversaw Rustin's confession, in which he says he never killed anyone. Kyle would eventually pass away in an institution on March 1st, 1971, due to self-inflicted wounds, and the connection between him and the Burkittsville 7 could never really be established. But there's enough there for conclusions to be drawn, if you believe. When it comes to horror sequels, the most common way to continue the story is to build upon what's been established while adding a few new things and retconning others, but in a way that still makes sense. Or you go in a completely new direction, but still maintain the spirit of the franchise. Book of Shadows follows the second rule, and conceptually, this is a solid sequel, but it fails in a lot of ways too. Book of Shadows respects the mythos of the Blair Witch, but does not care at all about the first movie. It takes the themes of isolation and hysteria from the first movie and shoves it in your face. But it also decides to take the more common approach of horror movies at the time and make the movie meta. We can thank Scream for that one. This is a bit of a commentary on the type of fans who get wrapped up into movies and live, breathe, and shit them. This movie makes a lot of fun of the first movie, and you may think, oh, so like a spoof. In actuality, this movie has no connections to the first movie outside of the lore, because the first movie is a movie in this movie, and this movie is a recreation of events that actually happened because of the first movie. It's basically Zodiac. But Ellie Kedward and all the established lore is true. The movie is focused on a group of characters, a self-proclaimed witch named Erica, a couple in Stephen and Tristan who are writing a book on the Blair Witch and also expecting, the resident goth girl who is also a psychic named Kim, and the driving force behind the movie named Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
Every single member has some sort of belief in the Blair Witch, whether it's believing in a connection, believing Ellie Kedward was actually good, believing in the mythos for research purposes, or exploiting people who believe in the myth for money. Bringing us to the overall message of the movie and to the single most important line that encompasses everything the Blair Witch is.
Because if people believe something enough, isn't it real? If people believe something enough, isn't it real? Perception is reality.
That's it. It's simple but effective, because when you look at the first Blair Witch Project, it's really not scary. But when you go back to when this first released and people believed it to be real, and well, it was the scariest thing anyone saw. In terms of expanding the lore, the movie doesn't really do too much. We get some added stuff about Ellie Kedward that I mentioned earlier with the handprints, and the added detail that she was hanged. We also get our first glimpse at the real Ellie with the only known photo of her. But nothing really major leaps out here, just a strong reinforcement that Ellie is the Blair Witch. The movie itself really does know its lore though, and makes heavy spins on it throughout the movie. Tristan ends up losing her child, but is shown drowning it in a river, which we know is strongly tied to the witch. Eileen even makes an appearance multiple times, alongside the Burkittsville 7, and possibly even the witch herself, but we'll save that. I instead want to talk about the most interesting character, and arguably the main character, and that's Jeff. Our first introduction to Jeff is of him talking about his love for the first movie, and quickly showing that he spent the prior 2 years in a mental hospital. The interesting thing about Jeff is he has a very strong parallel to that of both Rustin Parr and Kyle Brody. Sheriff Craven has this offhanded remark about how Jeff has been causing the town trouble since he was 10. And while this could be just an offhand remark, I want to give the credit and say the movie might be smart. Because Kyle Brody was also a troubled kid, and as an adult in and out of institutions himself, just like Jeff. Jeff also lives alone in the Black Hills, secluded, almost like a hermit. We also have this scene with Kim when she mentions Rustin Parr by name, and also just saw Rustin Parr, and who does she tell us all to? Jeff. I could be reading too much into it, but let's get crazier. As we know, it's been established that the witch talks to certain people. There's this theory floating around that certain people get drawn to the forest because the witch lures them, but she also uses other people to lure them to the forest, like in the Rustin Parr case. I'm of the belief that Jeff was leading this group of people to the witch because, yes, he's possessed, even if we only have a few bits of evidence really leaning to this. Erica asked Jeff to take her off his newsletter, and we don't know how or if he did, but there were files on all the people for the trip, which we later learned was the actual police files on them that somehow ended up there. We also have Jeff's personality switching once Kim makes mention of him being crazy.
Hey.
They should have never let you out. You're a long way from sane.
After this, Jeff is a lot more cold, short-tempered, and always watching the video feed. As he puts it, video never lies, but film does. Every person in this group also has symbols on them, except for Jeff. When Jeff reveals what he has by lifting his shirt, he has handprints on his stomach like the witch would have had. Also, when he kills Erica, what does he do? He immediately hides the body and puts her in the corner in the closet. And to tie it all together, to his quote, Kim is caught on video killing Peggy, Steven is caught on video pushing Tristan, but Jeff is only caught on video hiding the body. Not the same as the other two. All these deaths also tie into some quote the character said at some point. Kim mentions people looking at her like a serial killer, and Steven talks about how losing the baby made him feel. That's more of a narrative thing than it is a lore thing, but it's interesting. Jeff is also the one to immediately grab the camera once Tristan starts acting weird. But we can also just say Jeff was crazy, which is how the movie presents it, right? Going back to the whole, well, if you believe in it enough, doesn't that make it real? We also have time showing up again, but this time, it's like time repeating itself. For instance, Coffin Rock is pretty much repeated here. Two groups go into the woods, albeit for different reasons, but only one group leaves, with the second group ending up ritualistically killed at Coffin Rock. And who's the first person to deter the group to Coffin Rock? Steven. We also have our very first mention of dimensions here.
Coffin Rock.
What?
Coffin Rock. How the hell do you see Coffin Rock? What, can you see in other dimensions?
Now, let's talk about the witch. Okay, so every time something spooky happens, if you notice, it's in reverse. Eileen is dancing backwards, the children are walking backwards, even Erica walks backwards, and Tristan speaks backwards.
Kla, Niaga, Lee, Nerdlick, 8.
California.
That may not seem all that important, but when this movie was released on home video, so DVD and VHS, VHS is the thing in the Manda the Venture for all you Timmies, there was something of a bonus feature called The Secret of S Rever, reverse backwards, which coincides with how the group finds the missing time by going backwards. So scattered around the movie were words that were hidden in the frame that when put together made a saying. The best thing about this is Erica talks about hoping to be able to talk to Ellie and having a connection with her. A majority of these words can be found in scenes with Erica, as if the witch was talking to her but also to us. The first part of the phrase is, "Seek me no further or," but we get the last part from Tristan, spelling out, "Seek me no further or the children will walk free." You could punch that first phrase into the website and get some cool points. Neat. This is obviously Ellie telling the group to stop playing with her. We can also make a bit of a reach and say the final moments of Tristan was the witch, and this is how she tells people to do things. Since the entire time she's antagonizing the group, saying they don't have the balls to kill her, but this also could be just that, a reach. Since we can also play devil's advocate here and say it's mass hysteria. The group was isolated and began to see hallucinations, which we can blame on their consciousness as a way of putting guilt on themselves for what they did at Coffin Rock. Since video doesn't lie, we can assume all of that was real. The reason I say this was their guilty conscience playing tricks on them is evident by a naughty scene. I don't know why I'm saying naughty, I'm a grown man, but Naughty scene. Steven and Erica get hot and steamy, only for it to be them hallucinating. But as we see from the final reveal, they did in fact hook up during the night of being blackout drunk. So it could be that they subconsciously remembered and that was their way of feeling guilty about it. Same with Kim. When Kim kills Peggy, she takes her beer and drives away, gets home and stabs herself with a bloody nail filer in the back, the same tool she used against Peggy, which we can safely assume then that Kim did in fact kill her. She just forgets about it, but she kind of remembers subconsciously, going with that same kind of theme of guilty conscious. It's also funny how there's a subtle divide between the characters, where Jeff and Kim have more connections with the Rustin Parr case, while Erica, Steven, and Tristan are all more tied to Ellie Kedward. Tristan sees Eileen, she mentions how she saw through Ellie's eyes, and Erica, as we stated earlier, believes in a connection with Ellie, and Steven's connection is through both these women. We can even throw the number 7 around in this movie. We have 3 dead, Peggy, Erica, and Tristan, 3 locked up in Kim, Steven, and Jeff, but we know children are important to this franchise, so we can add Tristan and Steven's lost child, especially because Tristan symbolically drowns her in her dream in the river, which we know is important for whatever reason, giving us another number 7. By the way, I don't want you to think this is some amazing movie, despite me going on this long rant that may sound like it, because this isn't really that good. There's a good movie in there somewhere, especially with everything I've talked about, but it got lost in corporation meddling. The acting is supposed to be a bit dramatized, it's supposed to be a bit more glossy because the movie's intent is to be a movie. It's not supposed to be real like the original because the people who made this one knew you couldn't do a sequel, that's just more of the first. It just doesn't work, and oh boy, I can't wait to get to that. For now, let's jump back to the last 2 games. The second title in the trilogy of games is all about the Legend of Coffin Rock, no longer developed by Terminal Reality despite still being the Nocturne engine and instead developed by Human Head Studios, best known for their Rune franchise and Prey 2006. Let's not beat around the bush, as there's no real easy way to say this. This game is half-baked. Released only a month after the first volume, and while that game clearly knew what it wanted to do and understood the source material, this game got handed the clip notes and was told good luck. As we know, The Legend of Coffin Rock revolves around the search for Robin Weaver, and so getting a deeper insight on the incident should be interesting, right? Instead, the narrative is more focused on our main character, nicknamed Lazarus, while Robin Weaver is pushed to the background. She still plays a role in the game alongside her grandma and Chex Mix, but Lazarus' story is the main narrative thread, and I think this is where the problems start. Lazarus, whose real name is Robert McNichol, I think that's how you say it, was a soldier in the Civil War who led a troop of men into the forest to flush out opposing forces, only to come across supernatural occurrences that led to the death of him and his troops. That by itself is pretty interesting, but when you bring in the Robin Weaver story, you start seeing the awkwardness in making both stories fit to line up with what's been established. Except they kind of ignore certain aspects of the Robin Weaver story, and I'm sure some of the changes were for gameplay's sake, but it's hard to let that slide when the previous game did a really solid job with its rendition. Changing Robin to no longer playing in the woods and coming across a woman, to now being called to the woods. She still does make mention of a woman though.
I gotta go now, mister. The lady from the woods is calling me. But my grandma'll take care of you, so don't you worry.
They also change where Robin ends up at, now being sacrificed at Coffin Rock instead of the woman's basement. This lines up with what the previous game did, but changes the story completely. Sure, we can say being possessed causes her to forget some things, but it takes away her mentioning a house and the basement, and that was interesting because of what happened next in the timeline. The replacement is this random guy, who is as sketchy as someone can look. He lives up on the hill in what will be known as Rustin Parr's house, but apparently it was his house first. Okay. I don't know if he's possessed so much as making a deal with a demon, but he does transform into a demon for the final fight of the game, which is just executed terribly. The first game felt like you were piecing together a background of the mythos, finding out more about Mary Brown, Kyle Brody, even the woods themselves, where in this game you're running down a straight line and seeing flashbacks of a character who's never mentioned. You would think the town historian would have some sort of dialogue about a man named Lazarus or some creepy ass dude who lived in the house before Parr. I mean, we see a character who shows up in the third game in the first game. Okay, so the only interesting thing this game kind of semi-confirms is 2 entities. The forest and demons seem to be its own thing, but the witch does seem to be her own separate force with whatever motive she has going on there. Waking up Lazarus, telling him to do things, all as a way to help Robin, and this is evident by the way we heal, which is through Twanas. Even if the previous game established Twanas is more of a dimension thing, or we can say it was actually Grandma Weaver, or maybe she's the witch, because the voices do sound similar, except, you know, one's aggressive and evil.
You must hurry now. She's in great danger. Hurry! She needs you.
No wonder with a wound like that. Well, we'll just have to call you something, I suppose. I can't just have you wandering around like the living dead.
This could be an interesting link considering how Robin ends up in the first game, and the ending of this game, which is just a very weird way to end the game.
Hush now. You're okay. You're in a place of healing. You. Calm yourself. You've been shot in the head. You must remain calm.
But...
It's all right now, Lieutenant. You're going to be just fine.
This could be reinforcing the idea that maybe witches aren't evil, except I don't want to give this game credit. This game may flirt with the idea, but no, just no, you don't deserve that. It's cool to see the first search party leave knowing their fate, and even Grandma Weaver cautioning you not to go with them, but it just feels so retconny. Why couldn't our character be someone from the second party? Technically, it's still open to the second search party stumbling across Coffin Rock since Lazarus does interrupt the sacrifice, but it just feels so shoehorned. I think the reason this bothers me is because the lore so far has been established pretty well and was very much thought out, and to see this kind of stumble just leaves a bad taste. And that's not to mention the terrible gameplay here. I don't know what it is with these games that enforce combat sections, but they just love that shit. Having to clear ghost kids before moving on, or running around an entire forest map to clear human enemies and dogs before being able to leave, awkward boss fights that don't really leave you a lot of time to understand what's going on before dying, or a terrible boss fight where you cannot kill him until he steps in a certain spot that triggers a cutscene. With the first game, I chalked it up to, you know, older titles having some weird stuff happening because of modern hardware. This one, though, this one is because it's a bad game. You have a chicken leg in your pocket and you cannot use it no matter what. Why? Volume 3 takes us to a little after Ellie Kedward's disappearance, and while the game is titled after Ellie Kedward, it does not care one bit about her. The final volume was handed off to another studio, this time in Ritual Entertainment, and again released about a month after the previous title. I'm just gonna tell you, this game is a lot better than the last, but still considerably worse than the first. Jonathan Pyro is the main character this time, a former priest who we saw a glimpse of in Volume 1. Jonathan has lost his faith and decides to head to the town of Blair due to all the supernatural occurrences he's been hearing about. He figures that he might find answers or a reason to believe again. This already does a better job of respecting the lore because there is a similar letter in the documentary, so we can assume people would have heard the stories of Blair. Although the game does take it a bit too literal that people were fleeing the town. Okay, so I can't really ignore this topic. So the first game had some pretty good models, the second is okay if not a little washed looking. The third, well, it's definitely stylized, but the big heads are a little distracting. I also want to bring attention to these games keeping the voice acting feeling like the time they're set in and not modernized.
Good sir, I implore you, what terrifies the people so?
God has forsaken us into the arms of evil. Go back to where you came from, friend, before it's too late.
I'm vengeance. While the town is basically deserted, we still have a few people around. Jonah, the town's Father Goodfellow, Hiriam, the town drunk, and Elizabeth Styler, who's locked up because they found her at Ellie Kedward's house. They believe her to be a witch, she says she's a witch, and she ends up being a witch. Go figure. Jonathan is dead set on helping this town rid its evil. He wants to help in any way he can and even brought his super OP pistol. Okay. Jonah suggests checking out Coffin Rock, where we'll find a child and some demon voices.
The child must not be freed. Leave now or risk your own soul. Dear God, who speaks to me?
Ta-da! That's it. That's the game. We go around and save all these kids trapped by the demon. I do have a problem with this. It makes sense for the extended lore, I guess, like the games, and including Kyle Brody as the real suspect, but it just makes the first movie an even more head scratcher, because Coffin Rock is not as important as the powerhouse in that movie, unless you follow the two entities theory. But this game kind of kills that theory. Like, witches obviously exist, but it's all to serve demons. Ellie is around in this game, albeit in a demon form. And while the Native American mysticism is here, it's not expanded as much as it's used, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, basically, we use Native American tokens to transform to certain animals during certain sections. We also travel into the spirit plane to fight a thunder god named Hino, and then into the demon world to fight the main demon named Baal. Baal. This all feels really weird. How do we go from a story about a spooky witch to shooting a demon who kept trying to revive his minions? Also, why are we now replacing Baal with Hekaidomix? Unless that's his real name. My bad, did I say...
Of Hekaidomix.
Hekaidomix?
I meant...
To the dark spirit Hekatomix.
Oh, did I say that Baal was the final... Did I say that Bell was the final bad? The main bad guy who's been the driving force for everything so far in this game? I meant to say, Styler's demon form is the actual big bad. My bad, guys. These last two games clearly got told some sort of outline about things, but the team wasn't as well versed as the people behind the main mythos, even if they had some help. The fight against Styler is just awfully designed, in part because this game clearly has higher ambitions than the type of game it actually is. Early on, we're introduced to magical items that use our mana bar. Yes, there's a mana bar in this game. However, the core enemies are so dull that they don't really make use of all the weapons you come across. You get things like a giant AoE stun, a fire spear, a lightning staff, and even a Bible that drains enemies' life and yours but replenishes it if you kill someone. But most enemy types are just zombies or dogs. There's one single enemy type that requires you to use the stun or else you die basically. Outside of that, the pistol is just so strong and only requires bullets, which enemies will most likely drop after killing them, so there's no reason to use another weapon outside of its cool factor. Which brings us back to Styler. Styler, unlike other bosses, is pretty fast. She summons a mob like the previous boss, but instead of focusing on reviving them, she just spawns in new ones, alongside a variety of different spells, and you guys aren't even playing the same game anymore. She has a spell that drains life, one that stops your mana use, and one spell that holds you in place with lightning. If you get hit with that and enemies surround you, it's game over. You will die before you even get a chance to pop a health potion. If this game wasn't a tank control horror game, I could see this fight being a bit more fun, especially with a more open-ended area instead of a small circle. There's two endings, but I couldn't for the life of me play this game again to get both, I'm sorry. If you finish Styler with the Bible, you'll exorcise her and remove her possession, and get what I think is the good ending, since the other ending has her, die. Here she talks about running away together, and it's so wrong. Over the course of the entire game, Jonathan has been not nice to her at all, so why would he run away with you? He does end up with his faith back, and that's how the game ends, just straight to the credits afterwards. These two games clearly needed more time to develop, considering the game time of each is like 3 hours? Which game time should never be a comparison to if a game is finished, but these games don't feel finished. It feels very copy and pasted with enemies and a story that wasn't really fleshed out like it should be. At the end of the day, Ellie Kidward doesn't matter, and neither does Hekaidomix apparently. So surely, the next movie should bring something interesting, right? In 2016, at a little place called San Diego Comic-Con, a new Blair Witch movie was revealed and had already been filmed and will hit theaters on September 16th that same year. Directed by Adam Wingard, who directed Your Next, which was a good little horror movie, and was written by Simon Barrett. We'll be coming back to him. The movie uses one trope that really bothers me and is just so lazy. And that's that person A has been around since the beginning, but we just didn't know it. In this case, it's Heather's brother, James. They wanted to be able to tie this into the first movie, and this follows that first type of sequel I talked about way back when. Except they already had a way to do this that made sense with the lore and was already established. Just use Michael's brother. Especially because it's never mentioned that Heather has a brother. You would think during her confession scene she would give him a shout out, or anything, but she didn't because she clearly didn't have one. But this movie loves retconning things. James mentions that the forest the original trio got lost in was huge, but we know that the authorities were able to cover the entire forest when searching for them and found nothing. So just how huge was it? Don't answer that. We then get single-handedly the most insane retcon.
But Park claimed that he heard the voice of an old woman telling him to kill the children. He would take them up to his attic and make one stand in the corner while he killed the other one.
We're now changing that the victims were brought to the attic, all because this movie ends in the attic. And maybe we can make the argument with the whole time happens all at once that technically this happened when Heather was in the basement, but I don't want to give them the benefit of the doubt. When every single piece of media reiterates basement, 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 this is just a confusing change, but it's a change that makes sense for the movie since all these changes are made for scares. We're given more details about Ellie's banishment that according to a book in 1809, I'm gonna assume this is the previous book mentioned, which just makes it weird that this information is now being present, but I digress. According to the book, Ellie was tied to a tree and then had her limbs stretched by using rocks to weigh them down. And guess who shows up at a certain point in the movie? A long-limbed creature that is supposed to be the witch. Now, Simon has since came out and said this isn't the witch and is instead one of her victims. But that's BS. It's clearly meant to be the witch, but because of the backlash, they backpedal on the idea. Before I keep going in on the movie though, let's give it some flowers. The movie makes mention of the luring theory, which is a nice little call out. We also get some strong confirmation that things really only get crazy if you stay the night, which is supported by every movie, and the movie does use the time mechanic really well. Even if it does create a bit of a loop, because the first scene in the movie is the ending of the movie, and when James thinks he sees Heather, it is in fact Lisa. We also see the group fall asleep and wake up to it being dark still, which is a nice twist on things. And probably the most fascinating is the tree. When the group first arrives, there's a tree that's been hit by lightning, giving the viewer and group a location to remember. And by the end of the movie, we loop back around, except the first time there was clearly no house nearby. And the movie does recreate the Rustin Parr house pretty faithfully, even including little Easter eggs like Heather's camera and even the map Mike kicks. Another detail that's pretty hard to notice is when certain glitches happen, it's scenes from the first movie being spliced in. That's pretty neat. We also have what's probably the best way to subtly use the witch, and it's at the demise of Ashley. Ashley ends up climbing up a tree to get the drone down, but the witch pushes her, and it's done so well. In a blink and you miss it kind of way, and that's probably the best way to use the witch. Because they clearly did not want to make a Blair Witch movie. That's made pretty clear early on. When the group crosses the river, which, hey, nice to see it again, Ashley ends up getting her foot cut, and it's shown pretty frequently throughout the movie to be getting grosser and grosser. We have a tree falling on someone, we get creepy monster sightings, we get very shocking kills, and it all feels Hollywood. Not to mention, the Blair Witch series has never been a gory series. In fact, the only gore shown in the first movie is when Heather finds what we believe to be Josh's missing teeth and blood. But that's used as a this is real, Josh might be dead, instead of stacking up a kill count. That's not to mention that the movie is too clean. It feels scripted, it feels very well made, when the original felt real because it was, right? It didn't have a script, it was improvised, all that exhaustion the trio felt was real because making that movie was a complete nightmare. That just brings us to the main point though, and it's that it's really hard to make a Blair Witch sequel because you don't have a lot to work with. You're either retconning things so your story fits, or basically making the first movie, and let's be honest here, a movie about people being lost in the woods is just hard to make appealing. It really was magic in a bottle with that first movie, and to continue making this franchise work is hard. I do want to talk some shit about these characters some more though, because these characters are awful. James is so vanilla of a character, and is really just here because he's a link to the original movie, because the real main character is Lisa, who is supposed to be like Heather in a way. She's obsessed with the camera, with recording every little thing she can, which also works as a crutch because who in their right mind is grabbing the camera when being chased by someone who wants to kill you? Then you have the character I really can't stand, and that's Peter. I really don't like Peter, and James to a degree. It's because, okay, so Heather went missing making a documentary on the Blair Witch and fully believing the mythos. James finds what he believes to be evidence of Heather being alive by a guy named Lane who found the footage out in the woods. So maybe you would think something weird is going on, but anytime the Blair Witch mythos is brought up or someone really believes in it, it's laughed at. It's treated as one big joke between these characters, and it's obviously meant to come back around and bite the characters in the ass, but it just comes off annoying, and I don't like Peter. I get he's supposed to be the non-believer type character, but to bring up a good point, Peter's whole belief in the woods not being cursed is because he's been here before. He searched these woods with everyone else when Heather went missing, but nothing happened. But Lane makes a good point that he's back now, as if chosen again to come with more people. That's everything I wanted to cover about the Blair Witch. Okay, fine. In 2019 at E3, During the Microsoft conference, a new Blair Witch game was announced, developed by Bloober Team and were released late that year. Bloober Team at this point were well known for their breakout horror game, Layers of Fear, which was a first-person psychological horror game. The Blair Witch is also a psychological first-person horror game, putting us in the shoes of Ellis Lynch as he joins a search party for a missing child named Peter Shannon. Taking place in 1996, so 2 years after the original trio goes missing, but about 3 years before the film would be released. The narrative here is a bit messy. Ellis suffers from PTSD and all around has had a pretty crappy life. It's established early on that maybe Ellis shouldn't be helping with the search party, and most definitely shouldn't be going into the woods. At least he isn't going alone. Along for the ride is Bullet, our customizable canine friend who plays an important role in the game's mechanics. Bullet can bring you key items, trash, and the way you treat him over the course of the game will affect your ending. Just a heads up, I'm going to go really into this game, and to do that, I kind of need to talk about everything, so spoilers in case you haven't played. The reason the game's narrative is a bit messy is because the story kind of plays like a watered down version of Silent Hill 2, no pun intended. In fact, it's much closer to Homecoming. Ellis suffers from PTSD for a lot of reasons. When he was younger, he ventured off into the Black Hills Forest with his best friend, only for his friend to then go missing. He would later enroll in the military and then lead a squad into a trap that resulted in everyone being killed. He would then end up hiding at some point and taking a civilian's life. After being discharged, he ended up back in Burkittsville, got engaged to a woman named Jess, and worked as a cop under Sheriff Lanning. Ellis would then respond to a call about a robbery and ended up pulling the trigger on the culprit, who was Peter's older brother. Jess and Ellis would end up separated, and Lanning introduced Ellis to Bullet as a way to help with all this trauma. And this is all before we start talking about anything witch related. The game really shoves all of this in your face, by the way. It is not holding any cards in regards to that. It does reinforce some stuff in what I would say is some pretty clever ways. Like when we first see Peter on video and he's playing with a cop car. That ends up showing up again near the end of the game. Or how there's a constant use of gunshots we hear that works both when Ellis shot the boy and being shot at during war. They also constantly use this shot of the eyes because it's clearly something Ellis can never forget, so they make sure the players don't either. I won't say I dislike this use of PTSD, but it just feels so foreign to the Blair Witch. But it also does fit nicely with the theme of is it all real or this time all in his head. For the most part though, they do respect the mythos. To a degree. They follow the whole things only get crazy after spending the night. They keep the stick figures and even make use of the whole touch them does more harm than good. There's rocks, and they really push the time use to an extreme. You'll find yourself walking in loops from time to time, well, a lot of the time, visiting places at clearly different times, visiting the good old Rustin Parr house, and making use of time yourself with these red videotapes scattered around. These let you manipulate time, whether it's going back in time before a tree fell or pausing on a certain frame so a door is open. But the thing about this mechanic is that it's used very sparingly, when it's actually pretty cool, and could have been the main gimmick behind the game. Like, you do use a lot, but like, it could have been used more, you know? One thing that's actually pretty nice to see is the game kind of flirting with the idea of two entities, the Forest and the Witch. Not once in any of the previous movies does the Force play tricks or use things from a character's past as a way to mess with them. We do have demons taunting a character and another character mistaking someone for his sister, but that's never in the woods or because of the woods. The closest thing is maybe the lightning tree, but again, it's not from someone's past. But this game is clearly teasing the idea of the Force messing with our character. That brings us to the two entities. That's been teased heavily throughout most of the franchise. Here we have the Force with its tricks, but we also have a woman speaking to us at certain moments in the game. The woman also does sound eerily similar to Jess, at least I think so.
Yeah, well, neither did I, to be honest. Guess we're both full of surprises. So what are you up to?
Which would align with previous media that shows the witch using other people's voices. The story also makes use of time. Travel. We'll come across a video that contains Lanning's murder done by an unknown assailant, who will come to be known as Carver. You can see this coming a mile away. Carver is in fact Ellis. This is where the debate kind of sparks. Now, according to the wiki, it states Carver as a future Ellis, an Ellis that hasn't happened yet but will. Carver would be the one that would go on to kidnap Peter, kill Lanning, and even somehow go back in time and kidnap Ellis's best friend. If you choose to believe that, because it can also be interpreted as all in Ellis's head. This also can be used against all the supernatural stuff. Don't get me wrong, it creates an interesting debate, can really lean either way, except if we go by the game's ending. And most times when you say it's all in a character's head, it feels kind of a little lazy, but that's beside the point. For all intents and purposes, this game is a W key game. You interact with a few things, sure, but for the most part, you just walk a lot. There is a bit of combat. You shine your flashlight on some monsters and they go away after a few times, which ties into the game's ending, which there's a total of 4. But in reality, there's 2 core endings and minor tweaks. Think of it like this: it's a good plus, good minus, bad plus, and a bad minus. Besides the good and bad, Bullet also has his own ending, but just to be clear, you're probably guaranteed to get the bad ending on your first playthrough, because the game doesn't really tell you what you're doing is bad until around the end. By the way, the bad ending is just Ellis killing Carver and then becoming Carver. None of this is a problem, by the way, on your first playthrough. However, replaying the game is where everything kind of falls flat and really shows its flaws, which some people think is with full intent. To get the good ending and break the cycle, you have to do a few things. You can't interact with the cursed sticks or stones, and you can't kill the monsters with a flashlight. You gotta go around them or run from them. Except the monsters are mostly during the night section, and this game is pitch black without your flashlight. Even with the brightness turned all the way up, it's still really hard to see. And the thing that puzzles me is, at a certain point, your camera shows the outline of the monsters in red, but before that point, it doesn't show anything. Which, if it did, alleviates this problem entirely. Another big problem is the tedious final act. Like I said, on the first playthrough, all this stuff can be interesting and scary. On the second playthrough, and God forbid, subsequent playthroughs, this last act is brutal, taking place in the Rustin Parr house, and it is actually really cool to walk through this house in first person, in almost what feels like the same way the characters did in the movie. It's so cool. But when you come back here and you have to wait for things to happen and triggers to appear, it kind of shows its hand and becomes a little dull. This goes back to what I said. Some people are of the belief this is with intent to feel just like Ellis does, going through a constant cycle that doesn't really change until you finally break the cycle at the end, assuming that's the canon ending, or you just turn the game off and never touch it again. Which I can kind of see, as this game does test you in some aspects. Like when Bullet gets injured and you carry him, it feels like the game is practically teasing you to drop the dog, since if you don't, it feels like you walk forever in a loop. While aspects like this are cool, the game itself just isn't that fun to play. At the end of the game, we get the small deviations I was talking about, depending on what you do. So if you call Miss Landing and report the sheriff's death, that'll show up in the end stating his body was recovered. And if you don't, well, they don't know what happened to him. If we're to assume these last bits of text is canon, that would mean Lanning definitely did die at some point, meaning Carver is in fact a real person, just stuck in this constant loop until he dies. So I don't buy that this is all in his head, especially when things point to the opposite, like Lanning's death, Peter's rescue, and the tapes being left by Ellis.
Missing 9-year-old Peter Shannon has been found alive after 3 days of search. Police report that the boy was found wandering alone near Black Rock Road. The boy is in a state of shock and was unable to answer any questions, but authorities stated a third party may have been involved in the disappearance.
The game leans really hard on the PTSD aspect, and doesn't really push the mythos forward in any way, but it is cool to finally hear the witch interact with somebody. And while the time stuff was pushed to the extreme to a degree, I love when things loop around. Like Ellis being the one to tell himself to turn on the lights of the truck, and how that affects both future and past Ellis. Making it day in the past, and also helping future Ellis in the Parr house by making a path for him, keeping with the theme of time is all at once. Or how all these tapes are from Ellis. My favorite is when we finally have a confrontation with the witch, which I think this is the witch, and we see 2 Ellis, one die and one hide in the corner, which, because we have the camera on us, means we were the ones to create this, and left behind the tape for our past selves, or future selves, or past selves. Anyways, and it's not like Bloober Team doesn't know the lore, because they even give a little shout out to white enamel. That's good.
Well, how could it not? Even the shortest description sounds eerie. An obscure black and white documentary shot in various mental asylums.
Yeah, and as we all know, mental care in the 60s wasn't exactly top-notch.
Oh, it certainly wasn't. One might even go so far as to call it atrocious, and that is precisely what this movie shows. The macabre treatment of patients in these institutions. Now, it goes without saying, the film is not for the faint of heart. The force-feeding scene is particularly hard to sit through. We watch as a tube is inserted through the patient's nostril, all the way down his throat. A nutrient liquid is then pumped straight into his stomach.
And that finally covers everything Blair Witch that I wanted to cover. So for the sake of being a completionist, let's go over some stuff I know someone's gonna ask about. The stuff I missed. Let's start with the least important thing, which is the Sticks and Stones documentary. I skipped this one because this just felt like a condensed down version of Curse of the Blair Witch. Same interviews we know, a few things of alternate footage. I guess we do get a conversation with Joshua's dad, and even some more deleted footage with Heather and Mike, but it just felt like everything we already went over and didn't really tell us anything new. When Book of Shadows released, there was a documentary that was released around the same time called Shadow of the Blair Witch. This is the real life portion of the movie, if that makes sense, going over the actual case and even including familiar faces again. This documentary just paints Jeff as a crazy who was obsessed with the Blair Witch, and reiterates some of the mythos previously established like Coffin Rock. It's nice to see more added about Jeff, but About a year after the first movie, a series of books would begin getting released called The Blair Witch Files, which was written by a man named Cade Merrill, who the stories are also about as he is the cousin of Heather. He's looking into the disappearance of Heather, and these are the stories he's encountered through people from his online website. I'd obviously be here forever if I decided to tackle these, and from what I gathered, a lot of people tend to brush these off as non-canon. But if you've read these books and found anything interesting, let me know down below. Same with the 4-issue comic that was released titled The Blair Witch Chronicles. I cannot find any kind of summary or details about these comics, aside from buying them on eBay, and well, I'm broke. So if anyone knows anything about these, that'd be nice. Okay, so the actual important one that I did leave out, but I couldn't really find a way to fit it in, is the dossier. This was written as a bit of a continuation to the first movie, taking all the information from the Blair Witch website and puts it into a book basically. It gives us backstories about the trio, and guess what? No mention of a brother, I'm just saying. Heather's diary is also in here, which was also on the website, and just keeps reminding us that Heather was extremely obsessed with the witch and really wanted to prove she was real. That's not the only person in the group that was obsessed though. Here is where we find out Joshua was also extremely fascinated with the witch. And even more fascinating is the book alluding to the woods being the real evil of the land and predating Ellie Kedward. Not like we didn't go over this already, but you know. Which I should clarify has always been the plan according to Ben Rock. He was pretty active on Reddit a few years back and made some comments that talk about this. Ben Rock was a producer who worked on the original movie and had a hand in the mythos, and also oversaw the lore of the first 3 games and made the Burkittsville 7 documentary alongside the Shadow of the Blair Witch. So the story was always supposed to lean in that direction. Outside of the first game, the rest of the games don't really flesh that part out all that well, and it's not on Ben, but it would have been interesting to see what the original team would have done for a sequel. I swear, I saw there was a web series about Ellie Kedward, but anytime I Google that, nothing pops up, so maybe I'm just crazy. There was another Blair Witch sequel kind of made by one of the original creators. That was a bit of a behind the scenes of the new movie, but was actually the movie. I didn't check it out because this was already a project I thought would be out by Halloween, and it's whatever date it is. To me, the Blair Witch series is all about subtlety. It teases you with just enough supernatural that leaves you questioning if it was real, which I think some of the games and one of the sequels kind of misunderstood. But it also could be the product of the time, where things were way harder to get information about and audiences didn't need a jump scare every 5 seconds, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just, I don't think this is the franchise for it. Since this franchise was based off of being real, the idea, I say real in quotations if you didn't, I don't know if that came across in my saying. Anyway, the idea of something supernatural was real was the driving force behind the first movie. It's what scared the directors and what the directors hoped people would get scared off of too. That about wraps up everything for the time being. I know there's a sequel being made currently, but who knows about that. I also highly doubt another game will come out for this franchise, and maybe that's for the better. But I did hear really good things about the Blair Witch board game under Hunt a Killer. Maybe one day I'll cover that if I can find it, or you know, I'm not broke anymore, who knows. If you were to ask me what the best things from this franchise would be, it would be the first movie, the first 2 documentaries, and maybe the first game. As a side note, I literally just finished writing this, and then I hear about a 3-hour fan edit that puts all the extra scenes from the new release. I hear it's the best way to watch the movie now, but I'm burnt out on the, I can't take B-dubs anymore. Like, I've been doing this for a minute. Like, I'm good. But I hear it's good. I hear it's really good. You should watch it. Check it out, you know? The Blair Witch as a film series is kind of not that good. But the lore is really well, it's established pretty well, it's thought out pretty well, and at the very least, each iteration of media tries to use the mythos in different ways. Keyword tries. I don't think there's much else I can really say about this franchise that I have in the last hour or however long this video has been, but I do hope you found something interesting here yourself or something new you didn't know about the Blair Witch, and as always, until I see you next time, take it easy. Okay, fine. One more thing.
That freaking thing! That's right, it's a nigga, no rat.